Good morning, everyone. It's Tuesday morning, and that means Writers Chat. So here we are, where craft connects community. And we are so glad to have you with us, whether you're here or whether you're watching the replay. We thank you for doing that. My name is Johnny Alexander. I am joined by my co-hosts, Melissa Stroh and Brandy Bro. And Melissa is going to introduce our special guest today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited about today's topic and our guest because apart from being an author who writes historical fiction, I'm also an avid reader of fantasy and love all fantasy genres. And so today we're going to talk about a hybrid genre that's been emerging in fantasy. Well, our guest is, and we're going to get to learn a little bit about it. But before we jump right into that with Laurie, I'd like to introduce to you Laurie Lucking. Laurie Lucking loves books, music, and spending time with her husband and four kids in beautiful Minnesota. When she finds a spare moment, she writes young adult romantic fantasy inspired by fairy tales. Laurie's novels have won the Excellence in Editing Award and finaled in the Carol Awards. And you can visit her at www.laurielucking.com to find out more and sign up for her monthly newsletter. And today she's going to share with us about Romantasy. And I'm very excited to hear about it. And I know we've got a lot of people in the audience who are eager to hear too. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Laurie. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I am absolutely honored to be here. I was just sharing with them before we got started that I am not much of a public speaker. I can be a little awkward, so I apologize in advance. But if any topic could convince me to come do a talk, it's romantasy. It's absolutely my favorite genre, my favorite thing to read, my favorite thing to write. So I'm really excited to be here today. And it's also fun. I know Pam Halter, who's one of your longtime members. I looked back and saw some of your prior talks and saw a lot of familiar faces there too. So I kind of feel like we're old friends already. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Also, please excuse me, my voice is a little questionable today, which always happens when I have a presentation.
Sure.
It's kind of inevitable. So I'm going to be drinking a lot of water, but we'll get through it. Please let me know if you can't hear me, but hopefully it'll hold out for our time together here. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited, and I am now going to attempt to share my screen. It worked before, so hopefully we can make it work again. I did put together a little presentation.
There we go.
Um, okay, everybody see it? Are we
Yes,
good?
yes.
Yes, we're
Okay,
good.
excellent. All right. So I figured the talk really didn't need anything fancier than like romantasy. Let's talk about it. Because yeah, it's a growing genre and there are a lot of fun things happening with it. So well, now we need to figure out how to won't let me advance my slide. Hmm. Any of you techies have a
Oh no.
Oh, there we go.
Brandy.
We got it. Okay.
Aha,
Okay.
there we go.
I
There we
just
I
go.
needed to
always
click in a
struggle.
different spot. It's all
Yeah.
good. It's all good. So yeah, I'm Laurie Lucking. I'll start with a little bit more about myself. And it's funny that again, the subject of romantasy is near and dear to my heart. I really think I took an interest in it before I even knew what a genre was. I have vivid memories of myself as a young girl playing with my ponies, and there were elaborate kind of courtship rituals where the suitors would present my most beautiful, rocks or seashells to the girl that they wanted to marry. And, so I think I was interested in that blend of romance and fantasy before I really knew anything about it. And so here we are today, still one of my favorite subjects. But it took me a while to become a writer. I have always loved reading and always loved stories. Unfortunately, I had a few kind of creative writing assignments in grade school that didn't go very well, usually because I had a much bigger idea for my story
Mhm.
than what I had space for. And so I kind of convinced myself that I was not good at creative writing and pursued other things. I became an attorney, which does involve actually a lot of research and writing, just in a very different vein. And Practiced that for a few years, but then when my oldest was born, I became a stay-at-home mom, and I really was in desperate need of a creative outlet. I loved being home with my son, but 3 months olds aren't very interactive, and you need something to keep your mind occupied. And I had the crazy idea one day to, well, what if you wrote down these stories you're always dreaming up? And it was kind of, well, no, no, I'm not good at that. I couldn't do that. But, then I finally decided, what's there to lose? One never has to read it. But it turned out I loved it. I had so much fun writing my first story, which will never be published, but I learned a lot in that process. And by the time I was done with that story, I was hooked and I wanted to keep writing and I wanted to learn about publication. And so I, as I put on here, I first started writing in 2012. That's when my son was born. He's 13 now, crazy thought. And I got my first novel published in 2018. Um, and that was this book, Common, which is, as it were, a romantasy. Um, and that was with a smaller publisher that I had a great experience with. They published really high quality books and were wonderful to work with. Unfortunately, the marketing and the sales side of things was a little harder, and they did close last year. I was fortunate enough that Common and my second book, which is kind of a companion novel, so it's part of a series but not about the same character, was also published through them. So they became unpublished for a while, but they were picked up by a new publisher and republished within the last year. So those are back out, which has been very exciting. I also, within toward the end of last year, published two novellas. One was A Noble Purpose, and one was The Dancer and the Dragon Speaker. I did not pick the purple dress theme, but it was kind of going for me last year. And both of those were independently published novellas, but with multi-author projects, so a multi-author series. And I'll talk more about that later because that's actually really big in the romantasy genre right now. So those two came out last year. I've also kind of in the midst of that published 8 different short stories through a variety of time periods. I as we mentioned, I have 4 kids, so my writing has kind of ebbed and flowed through various seasons of my life, and so sometimes a short story is kind of all I could handle in a given moment. But it was a nice way to keep writing and keep publishing, keep some momentum going, even when I didn't have a lot of time to pursue that. Almost everything I've written has been a blend of romance and fantasy. There are a couple really short stories that didn't have any romance, but otherwise, that's really always been the genre that has drawn me all along. And yes, I have been fortunate enough to win a few awards. The Excellence in Editing Award went to both Common and Trader, and they also were both finalists in the Carol Award. So I've been very blessed on my journey so far, and I'm excited to see what's next. But now, what you're all here for is let's talk about romantasy. So, to find a definition of romantasy is a little tricky because it's not a real concrete idea, but it also can be called fantasy romance, romantic fantasy. And I thought that Wikipedia did a decent job of defining it. They call it a subgenre of fantasy fiction that combines fantasy and romance, describing a fantasy story using many of the elements and conventions of the chivalric romance genre. One of the key features of romantic fantasy involves the focus on relationships, social, political, and romantic. So I would generally agree with that. Basically, it combines romance and fantasy. The name isn't too hard to figure out. It's a blending of the two. I'd say yes, it usually, if you look at Amazon categories for books that are in romantasy, I would say typically fall under more fantasy categories, but they certainly can get categorized under romance as well. And the books on the bottom are all wonderful books, so please don't, I don't have them X'd out because of any quality issues, but I wanted to kind of help define what romantasy is with what it's not. And so there are some, the Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potter examples are both very much fantasy stories that do have a few romantic elements. They have a few characters that end up in romantic relationships. But I would say in those stories, the romance really does not play a heavy enough part in the book to be considered romantasy. So those are more, they're still fantasy with a little bit of romance. On the other side, we have The Healer's Apprentice, one of my all-time favorite books, An Uncertain Choice, a lovely story by Jodi Headland. Those two, I would say, they're both historical romance, but each have a little hint of the supernatural. In The Healer's Apprentice, there's a healing that takes place that's very miraculous, and so feels a bit out of the ordinary, out of our ordinary experience. An Uncertain Choice, there's this somebody made a promise on a kind of holy tear or something. I don't remember the exact circumstance, but again, it was a little bit supernatural. It was a promise that was more binding than what an ordinary promise in our world would be. However, in both of those cases, I would say, even though there's a slight element of the supernatural, it doesn't have enough fantasy to be considered romantasy. So it's to truly be romantasy, it really needs to have a heavy component of both the romance and the fantasy piece to truly fit in that genre. As like I said, kind of malleable as that definition is, if it doesn't have both of those components really strongly, then I wouldn't consider it to fall within kind of that sweet spot that is romantasy. So romantasy has been around for a long time. On the left side there, I showed a few books that have been out for quite a while that I read when I was a kid and loved. And honestly, I was really looking for romantasy before I knew what romantasy was. Like I said, that was where my imagination went from a young age. But they weren't necessarily easy to find back at the time. They did exist, but they were kind of few and far between. Now it has really exploded in popularity. There are romantasy books all over the place. And the top four that I put there are all mainstream, very popular books. The two sets below are all independently published books, but it's really popular in both areas, really. Traditional, indie, you can find romantasy anywhere. And before I get farther, I want to specify that, I think sometimes when people think romantasy, their mind goes to kind of a alpha male, dragon shifter, fated mates, really heavy open door scenes. Certainly there's plenty of romantasy that is that. However, there is tons of clean romantasy out there as well. There's a lot of no spice, closed door, whatever you want to phrase it. There's a wide range on the spectrum. There's certainly some Christian romantasy as well that specifically has that faith component. So there really is, I'd say, a niche of romantasy for really any comfort level in your reading, whatever level of romance you're looking for. There's certainly plenty of young adult romantasy as well as adult. Of course, it doesn't get too young just because of the romance piece, but yes, there's a huge wide range. So whatever kind of flavor you'd be looking for, whatever level of cleanness you're looking for, it exists because it's really exploded in popularity and tons of people are writing it right now, which is very exciting for readers like me who are looking for new romantasy options. So I think, we talked about what is romantasy. I think that's relatively easy to comprehend, even though it can be a bit of a fluid definition. But I think a lot of people are asking right now, why romantasy? Why is this such a popular genre? Why has it exploded the way it has? And does it have staying potential? That's always a question about trends. Hard to say, but I hope so. And I think so, because I really Of course, I might be biased because I love Romantasy, but I really think it's a genre blend that brings a lot to the table and has a lot of potential to just keep creating great stories. And the reason for that is kind of comes from the pros and cons of the genres that it blends together. So, romance, you have the pros that it's timeless. We've been telling love stories since the beginning of, since we know of the first stories, right? We've always been telling romance stories. It's something that almost everybody experiences in their life, whether it's a successful romance or not. Most of us have felt that draw to another person, that excitement of that attraction. So it's kind of a universal theme. It's something that, the true romance readers never get tired of reading about people falling in love. And so it's something that so many people can understand, so many people are drawn to. The happily ever after, is always, it leaves you feeling good after a book. It gives you hope. It inspires you, and it leaves you with a smile on your face. So there's something very, very satisfying about a romance that has a beautiful happily ever after kind of ending to it. But where romance can have its downfalls is that it can feel sometimes a little predictable. We've all laughed about Hallmark movies, right? And even if you love them, you have to kind of admit that they're a bit formulaic at times. And romances, if maybe in a historical setting, you can get a lot more creative with some of the sources of conflict if they're on different sides of a war or something like that. But sometimes in contemporary romance, and certainly authors get very creative with this and have so much fun with this genre, but sometimes it can feel a little bit like, oh, he's keeping a secret and that's going to be the big conflict. Or if they would only just talk to each other, this book could have been 100 pages shorter. Right? Sometimes the romance genre can feel a little bit like you almost have to make up sources of conflict to keep the tension there and keep the story going as long as you'd like it to go. So that's can be the downside of romance sometimes. Now, fantasy, I feel like has very different pros and cons. Fantasy, the pros are that it's really imaginative, right? The creativity can go any direction. The world is not limited by our own experience. There can be fantasy creatures, there can be special powers, there can be all kinds of things that are outside of our own experience, and that keeps it really fun and creative and unpredictable. It also tends to be very adventurous. Usually there's a lot happening. There's people journeying or, fighting for something major. So there's a lot of adventure involved, and you're exploring a world that you've never seen before, right? It's a brand new world, so it just feels more adventurous getting to explore more of that place with the characters. And there tend to be really high stakes. A lot of times they might involve royalty, or somehow the fate of the kingdom, the fate of the world is at stake. And so these characters have major high stakes that they are fighting for. And so that keeps it very exciting and fresh. Now, the cons of fantasy can be that it's too out there. It can be, if the world doesn't feel at all familiar, it can almost lose readers as far as, well, I can't ground myself in this at all. I can't picture it. This doesn't feel like it has enough of a connection with me to feel like it impacts my life, or like I'm feeling an emotional connection to it. Sometimes, the names that you can't pronounce, the places you can't pronounce, after a while, you can't keep track of them because they're all 20 letters long. And, at its worst, fantasy can get a little painful that way sometimes. Sometimes it can be hard to follow, if the author has a really elaborate history of how these kingdoms came to be and how things came to be the way they are, or if it's a magic system that has so many rules that you're like, I can't follow this. So that can very much be the downside of fantasy, is that if it's not grounded enough in our own reality or our own experience, or if it just takes off too far into world building without a real connection to the characters, to the plot, it can lose readers in that way, that it's so far out there that they can't bring it into their own experience and their own imagination. And so I think what Romantasy does really well is that at its best, it combines both of those strengths in those genres. It takes that creative imagination of the fantasy, that those high stakes, the adventure, and it pairs it with that timelessness, that universal feeling of romance. And so while fantastical things might be happening, you're also experiencing the very familiar experience of falling in love in the midst of that, of seeing two characters getting to know each other better, having those very familiar feelings of kind of nervousness, excitement, uncertainty of the relationship, that kind of thing. And so that kind of brings that fantasy back enough to a human experience to keep it really fresh, but also make it an emotional connection and make it easy for the reader to relate to, even if it's in a fantasy world. So as I said there, it's kind of, it has less of the predictability of potential predictability of romance, but it's easier to relate to than fantasy. It also does have a lot more series potential, because if you have major things happening in your fantasy kingdom, it can kind of be easier to draw out that romance for a few books without making readers feel really unsatisfied, because there's so much more happening than just that relationship, that they're willing to go along with you for that slow burn, even if it might make them a little impatient sometimes. I know I certainly have had those moments of, oh, they didn't get together in this book yet. Um, but but yes, so it also has a lot of series potential as well, which can be a real benefit as a writer. So I know that you all have had plenty of writing craft kind of talks, and that's not really my main purpose today, but I did want to point out a few things that I think are most important for romantasy. A few tips that if you're looking to get
Oh, did Lori just freeze?
to
Oh,
appeal to
there we
more
go.
readers, some tips that specifically I think romantasy readers are looking for, that can be useful if that's what you are interested in writing. So I think the biggest thing in romantasy is remembering that you have double the genre expectations, right? Every genre, its readers have certain expectations, certain things they want to see. And in romantasy, if you truly want to fall in that romantasy box, you can't leave out readers from either side of the genre, from either of those two genres that you're blending. And so, for instance, the fantasy has to feel otherworldly. There has to be something that transports that reader from their outside of their own experience. And again, a couple of those books that I showcased earlier that are fantastic historical romance books that feel slightly supernatural, you have to take it a step farther than that if you truly want to appeal to a romantasy crowd. Um, but it doesn't have to involve magic. I know as Christians, and we don't need to go down this debate today, but I know, Christians have varying levels of comfort with magic. Some not at all. Some, are comfortable with it as long as it's clear that it's not something that has been forbidden, as long as it's not super dark, that kind of thing. So there can be a wide range of that. And not all fantasy needs to involve magic. In fact, there's a whole genre called kingdom fantasy that doesn't. But even if it doesn't involve magic, there needs to be something fantastical about it, something that makes it feel different. And so one of the books that I published last year, this A Noble Purpose, it was part of a multi-author series where It's all Christian, non-magical fantasy. And so for me, that always is a bit of a challenge. It's fun to not write magic, but it's also, magic is kind of a nice, obvious thing to make it feel like fantasy right off the bat. But what I did in this book, of course, part of it is you make up a new world with its own history, with its own kingdoms, and some of that in and of itself feels fantastical, right? Because you can have kingdoms at war and that kind of thing that don't exist in our world. So that automatically gives you some fantasy content and some potential for those high stakes that I mentioned. But something else I did in this book that readers have brought up so many times, and it's so fun. I love that people have been sending me memes related to this and that kind of thing. Clearly, it really stood out to people, was that my main character goes on a journey to find someone that she wants to bring back to the palace. And it's a long mountainous trek. It's kind of the landscape was kind of inspired by, I'd say, like Scandinavia. And so instead of just riding horses, which would be, obviously in our world what one would do, I had the characters ride elk. And that was kind of just the normal, they all have their elk that they keep in stables and that they ride. And so I had to do some research involving that, which was actually really fun. And like I said, it's really fun how many readers have commented on, and I loved the elk. And so even just a small detail like that kind of took people outside their normal experience, and made it feel more fantastical, even without, superpowers or magic, that kind of thing. So like I said, fantasy needs to have something like that, even if it's just your characters riding elk around in the mountains. Um, the romance side, you really need to delve deeply into those relationships. The reader, romance readers want to experience the relationship. They don't just want to hear that, oh, yep, those two had a bit of an attraction, and oh, yep, they ended up together at the end. They want to be the one experiencing how that relationship is developing. They want to be there for those key moments, and they want to feel that emotional connection as deeply as the character does. And so to satisfy a romantasy reader, you really need to deep dive into that romantic relationship. It can't just be a side part of the plot. And it has to end with a satisfying happily ever after. That is what your romance readers are looking for, and that is equally what your romantasy readers are looking for. The fantasy stuff can all be exciting and great, but in the end, the couple needs to end up happily together, or you're going to have some really dissatisfied readers. Um, and I think what's really cool about romantasy is that if it's done really well, the fantasy and the romance elements intertwine with each other to add complexity and emotional depth to the story that would not be there without either one of those elements. And so like one of my favorite examples of this is a book called Fierce Heart by Tara Grace. And it's a story where humans and elves have been at war for years, and this human princess offers to be a part of an arranged marriage with an elf prince so that to kind of help solidify a peace between their people. And the book is so powerful because it is certainly very fun and satisfying to see the two of them get to know each other and eventually add some romance to their marriage. But it's also really cool because she really embraces her role. She's really joyful about it and really, really working hard to create peace between their people. And so she teaches the elves a lot about humans and kind of helps dispel a lot of their stereotypes. And meanwhile, she learns a lot about their culture and their kingdom, and kind of helps by herself, to create a lot of that peace. And so it's a neat story in that, it just says a lot about cultural barrier cultural barriers, I can speak, and stereotypes and, things that, yes, we're not dealing with elves, but, our world has all kinds of places where people are misjudging each other and not taking the time to get to know each other. And so it's beautiful how that particular romance also affects the fantasy side of the story, but then also touches readers' hearts in a way that affects their day-to-day lives too. And I think that's really a beautiful blending of those two genres. An example from one of my books is The Dancer and the Dragon Speaker was another book that I came out with last year, and it involves a princess, well, she and her sisters, a set of princesses, who a prince from another kingdom is using dragons that he's able to control to threaten them and coerce them. And so she is very much looking for a way to get rid of these dragons, but she meets someone who seems to know a lot about them and is kind of trying to figure out if he has any information that could help her. Finds out that he actually um, feels very fondly towards dragons and actually wants to save these dragons rather than get rid of them. And that's a real difficult point in their relationship. But then when she realizes, he slowly helps her understand that they're actually being controlled, that the dragons are not the ones who are choosing to be threatening and to force them to do these things. And so they kind of together move forward both in their relationship, but also in kind of helping her understand the nature of the dragons in this particular world. And then that leads to them being able to work toward freedom for these princesses as well. So again, when you can really intertwine those in a way that the story doesn't work without the fantasy and without the romance, when they kind of need each other to move the story forward, I think that makes the very best romantasy. So another thing that I think is very important for romantasy specifically is to look at point of view, especially because fantasy writers in particular can have a tendency to, especially real epic fantasy, to kind of want to be that omniscient storyteller kind of point of view. And that can work great for some fantasy stories, but it's not going to work for romantasy. Your romantasy stories, again, your reader wants to experience that relationship on a very deep level. And so you can't just tell them about it from a high level perspective. They have to be right there in the story. And so the points of view that are going to get that for you are either first person, which I know not everybody likes to write first person. I get that. So deep third person is another option where, yes, you're talking about the characters in the third person. It's, the name or he or she or whatever, but you're really, the reader is still being taken right on that character's journey versus being told about it from a distance. Um, because again, those relationship-based stories, the readers really want to be right on that level with the character experiencing it alongside them. So also tense can vary. So some are written in present tense. That really does, if done well, can feel very immersive because it's kind of like you're experiencing it with them right in the moment. However, there are some readers that's an absolute turnoff for as well. That can definitely be a reader pet peeve. So past tense is also very much an option and can still feel very immersive, especially if you're careful to avoid things like passive verbs, those feeling sensing words that kind of add that barrier in the narrative. So for the feeling sensing words, it's like, I saw him step toward me versus he stepped toward me, and in the he stepped toward me, you're right there, he's stepping toward you, whereas I saw him step toward me kind of takes you up to this level of you're watching the character watch him. And so just being careful to really make it as immersive as possible. And certainly passive verbs are going to happen, but just keep an eye on that in your writing to really make it as experiential as you can. And I would say past tense does tend to continues to be the most common choice, even though, like I said, it's maybe not quite as immersive, but it also is probably less controversial as far as how readers are going to respond to it. And present tense can be really difficult to write in. I have never successfully done it, but some people do it really well. So you have to kind of understand yourself and your own writing. I'd also recommend, just reading a lot in the genre to kind of see what stories bring you the most in, and what is it about them that you're finding immersive and that's drawing you in. So Romantasy is also all about the tropes. There is, and certainly all genres are doing a lot of that right now, where like you see the graphic with like the book cover and all the different little arrows pointing to things. But Romantasy has some tropes that are very, very popular right now. Fairy tale retellings are huge, which is awesome for me because that's one of my favorites. But fairy tale retellings, it's fun because I think people can take those fairy tales that, again, kind of like a love story. It's a very when everyone hears Cinderella, they know what comes to mind right away. And yet, especially in fantasy worlds, you can take that in so many different directions. And so it's fun to kind of have something that grounds you and that certain elements to expect, but also if authors do it well, they can take you in tons of unexpected directions as well. So yeah, you'll find fairy tale retellings all over the place in this genre. Enemies to More is another very popular, people who are from enemy kingdoms that end up falling in love with each other, or, I feel like Enemies to More has a lot of banter potential, right? A lot of fun, wittiness, a lot of conflict potential, right? And a lot of deepening of the characters' understanding of themselves and of each other, which can make for a great relationship. And this too, every book I have on here are clean. So again, certainly you're going to have plenty of enemies to lovers romance in spicier versions of the genre as well, but there are plenty of clean options out there. Um, Another one that's like that is Human and Fantasy Race. That certainly, again, there are going to be plenty of open door books like that, but there are a lot of clean closed door books of that option as well. The books I have on here, one involves an elf, one involves kind of the fae or like fairy world, and one involves a werewolf. There's certainly that's a very popular one too. Again, kind of as I was talking about before, it gives people a chance to um, come to understand a different race, a different culture, but also adds a lot of fun fantasy elements there. And then arranged marriage is another big one as well. I think especially when things like royalty are involved, their arranged marriage tends to be a nice one because it forces two very different people together who then have to figure out a way to make it work, which can make for very satisfying romance reading. And again, when you add those fantasy elements, that just ups the adventure and the imaginative aspects of it. So those are just four. I mean, there's certainly other ones as well, and a lot of them, like Fierce Heart, that was the one I was talking about earlier, is down in the arranged marriage category, but that's also human and a fantasy race, also kind of enemies to more. I mean, a lot of these tropes you find in multiple of these tropes in one book. But again, that fantasy genre allows you to take that in so many different directions that it can still feel fresh and new if you do it right. So marketing romantasy, certainly those tropes, not that you have to write in those tropes, but they if you're using popular tropes, it's always fun to let people know that because some readers are really looking for those. But some other ideas about marketing romantasy, if that's something that you are already writing or something that you're interested in potentially getting into. So your romantasy readers love beautiful covers. I think that's something right away that, certainly every genre your cover is important, but there's something about romantasy readers. I feel like that they want the full experience. They want every aspect of the book to be beautiful and immersive from the cover. And so, certainly a lot of girls in beautiful dresses on these covers. Sometimes you get a lot of couples on covers, as you saw, like in this one, there were a lot of couples, sometimes illustrated, sometimes not. But then also sometimes like a more symbol-based cover. If it has lots of beautiful elements and like the text has to be really fancy if you're going to do something like that. But yes, I feel like the cover, investing in a beautiful cover is a great start for Romantasy because that's going to catch your reader's eye right there. Um, Now a lot of these, so I have only published with smaller publishers and independently. So a lot of these are coming from my personal perspective of what I see a lot of indie authors do. However, I think of course something like an eye-catching cover is going to be huge for any traditional publisher as well. So a lot of these would be relevant no matter what route you're taking. But Kindle Unlimited tends to be more independent authors, although I have started seeing some traditional publishers taking that route as well. But, we all have varying opinions on Amazon and Kindle with very good reason. But I will say there are a lot of Romantasy readers on Kindle Unlimited. Since I started having books on there, my sales have gone through the roof. So that really, I would highly recommend at least strongly considering that, or at least, you don't have to stay in it forever. There's kind of different time periods that once you join, you have to be in for a certain period of time, and then you can get out again for a while. But it's certainly something worth considering because I think that's where a lot of Romantasy readers are hanging out because they tend to be pretty voracious readers. And so that's where they can find a lot of these books in one place without needing to buy them all separately. They Romantasy readers also seem to love things like artwork and special editions. I have up in the corner there the couple in a garden with the flowers. That's actually artwork I had done for one of my books. Um, the Malice in Wonderland I put on there because it has oh no, what's the word? Sprayed edges. Where like the edges of the book are decorated. That's becoming more and more popular. I'm seeing more and more editions coming out like that. So again, there's something about these Romantasy readers that just like they want every aspect to be beautiful and special um, and a lot of times, special editions and artwork are not cheap. But a lot of times people will do Kickstarters. I've seen a lot of those in the indie market for Romantasy to get people excited about a special edition, to give them all the artwork and the swag and different things, but also help pay for all the work that goes into making something with a lot of specialized artwork. Um, as far as reaching more readers, newsletter swaps is a really big, there's a huge author community, especially in the indie market of Romantasy writers. And everybody, there's a lot of people who tend to feature other people's books in their newsletters. And so I'm in a whole Facebook group that's pretty much dedicated to newsletter swaps. And, when people have a newsletter coming out or if they have a new release, they'll post about um, who's willing to share this, and I'm happy to share about your book then and mine. And so it's just a great way to share those readers and get the word out more broadly, because again, these tend to be avid readers. And so once they find one author they like, they're looking for similar authors. And so any kind of author collaborations really have been a great way to get the word out there and reach readers who are really looking for that specific genre. Also, book funnel promos, and I think Story Origin does a similar type of thing where, you can have sometimes it's as simple as like, clean fantasy romance, but sometimes it's more, I was part of one that was specific to 12 Dancing Princesses retellings. And those are where every author, authors who have a book that uh, fits that particular description joins, and then every author who's a part of it is expected to share about it and hopefully direct readers to that page. And then hopefully those readers again are discovering more books that are of a similar nature and hopefully snatching them up. So multi-author projects, I've referred to these a few times, and I'll do kind of just a high level right now, but if anybody's really interested in them, I'm happy to talk more about my experience. I've been in two multi-author projects so far, and what's interesting about these is that they all start with a certain premise, and like the intertwined tales is the easiest one to describe, I would say, of the ones I've been in. What we were supposed to do for that one was take two fairy tales, one that was well known and one that was lesser known, kind of an obscure fairy tale, and blend them together into a new story. And they had to be clean, and they had to be within like certain length parameters, that sort of thing. You know, we all had to agree to the same cover designer, but otherwise we all wrote our own stories. And so the stories in these novellas have nothing to do with each other. They are not, you know, we didn't have to try to collaborate on characters or world building, any of that. They're all completely separate, can be read in any order, can be read completely separately, but they are brought together by kind of that intertwined fairy tale theme. And, you know, then we all had a certain pattern to follow for our title. And as you can see, you know, we use the same cover designer, and they all coordinate really well, but are very different for each story. And what's really fun about these projects is that there's always a way for the authors to be communicating with each other throughout. And so it kind of gives you a built-in group of like brainstorming partners, because they want your story to be successful too, right? Because we're all invested in the entire series. Because then once the books, you know, we all together put together a release schedule. And then if everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, every book that comes out, all the authors in the series share about it. And so it's kind of a built-in hype team. It's a built-in way for more readers to find the series. And, you know, every book is getting, you know, is going to get shared lots of different places right off the bat. And again, you know, somewhere like Kindle Unlimited, these series are very popular because someone reads one and goes, oh, great, there's more books in the series, and they just keep going. And so it's just a great way to share that marketing potential, and it's really fun. I had so much fun with it, to feel like I had a whole team that I was writing with, even though our stories were so separate versus the solitary endeavor. And these are huge right now. I mean, any given point in time, I'm usually aware of at least two or three that are like actively being published. You hear about new ones all the time. I think a lot of the writers have just found that it's a really fun, easy way to really get some marketing going with those. And for readers, you know, it's a great way to meet new authors, and to, again, kind of, you know, if you read one and you like it, then you've got 10 more books or however many to just keep reading. And so yeah, it's a really fun concept, and it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. I haven't shared this broadly yet, but I've got a couple more that I've signed up with already, that'll be in the coming years. So yeah, it's a really fun way to get out there. But and certainly, you know, Romantasy isn't the only place that multi-author projects are happening, but it is very popular in the Romantasy genre right now. And it can be a great way to start getting your name out there with some other authors like that too. As you know, I know on each of these projects, a few of them, it was the first time an author had published. And you know, again, that kind of gets you right established right there with other authors in that genre, and it gives you a group of people who are very willing to answer questions when you are like, you know, what do I do about my ISBN? Or, you know, this formatting thing isn't working. You know, you have that built-in community who really want you to succeed and will take the time to answer questions. And so yeah, they've been a lot of fun to work on, and certainly something that's really fun about writing in the romantasy genre is that those projects tend to crop up a lot. And that's all I have. So I don't know. I will stop sharing so that we can all see each other a little better.
Wow, that was
Yeah, I'd love to know
terrific.
what questions people have, if any.
Well,
That's
yeah, we do
fantastic.
have
Yeah.
questions, but I'm going to invite people to come on, and then if there's questions that you want to ask that you put in the chat, you can go ahead and ask them that way. And Melissa and I
Yeah, I
both will
apologize. I
try
couldn't
to.
see the chat with my
No,
PowerPoint.
well, we
So
wouldn't
I'm
expect you
sorry. I'm sure I
to.
missed a
No, no,
lot.
no. We were monitoring the chat, so
Okay, good.
you did not have to do that. But we'll go back through and try to make sure we don't miss anything. So yeah, if everybody just wants to come on and then they can ask a question. I will just say, because one thing I worded it as a question and it's probably really not. I was interested in, like, you use the term chivalric. You pronounce that
Mhm.
different than I just did, though. Chivalric, is that how you?
I don't know if I pronounced it right,
I
so
don't know
you're
either, but
probably
oh,
right.
I like that. That sounded so, romance. And then what was the other one? Kingdom.
Kingdom.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I was like, those, I've never heard those terms before. So even that was just interesting to see that. Pam, I think you had a question somewhere in all of this,
Yeah,
didn't
when
you?
you was wondering, it was early on about Twilight. What was it?
If it
Oh, if it
started the
started
genre.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
If that was one of the key series that started the romantasy genre, or like made
Yeah.
it more in people's faces.
Yes, yes. I was going to say, I think that certainly was part of what made it popular for sure, was something
Mhm.
that because that became so popular. And I would guess for a lot of people, that was the first romantasy they probably
Mhm.
read. And it was so, so many people liked it that yes, then I think, then of course, a lot of writers started to want to write that kind of thing
Yeah.
too, and a lot more came out. So yes, I would agree that Twilight was definitely one of the launching pads for the romantasy genre
Yeah.
as far as kind of getting it out there. Again, there were some niche books out there before, but as far as getting it really mainstream, I think Twilight
Yeah.
absolutely was one of
And
the
my
books that
my
did that.
Mary was in high school, I think, and all the kids. I was doing
Hmm.
music direction for summer theater then for the kids show, and all the girls were. So I said, "Let me get a hold of this and read it and see." I found the world building fascinating,
Hmm.
but I gotta say, her MO, right, is slow. She's a slow burner. She like the first three quarters of that big first book were so dry and boring. And I said to Mary, how are you girls sticking with this? How's anybody's but once she gets going, that last part of the book and then the other in the series, whoosh, she was
Very
off and
exciting.
running.
Yep.
How does that get past an editor? But yeah, I could see why it pulled people in because it was different from anything that was out
Hmm.
there.
Absolutely.
Okay. Were there any other questions? A lot of comments. I mean, I really not I don't
Yeah,
think
we have a busy chat.
Well,
I did have a busy.
could you kind of address what kingdom romantasy is? Well, is
Oh,
it just
yeah.
Sure.
building a kingdom
Yeah.
or what is it?
Yeah. So Kingdom Fantasy is basically fantasy that doesn't involve magic. And so,
Okay.
that can be a little bit because certainly, sometimes people will have like innate powers or they're just fantasy, the world has dragons, but like no magic is happening or that kind of thing. But Kingdom Fantasy really feels historical typically, except that it's not our history. It's
Mhm.
it's like historical fiction in a fantasy world, I'd say, where again there's no magic. There's really typically not much that's different as far as what's possible in our world is usually the only things that are possible
Yeah.
in a kingdom fantasy, but they just have different kingdoms or countries, different history. So it usually stems from that. It's kind of fantasy because it's in a fantasy in a world that's not our own, but the world has pretty much the same limitations that our world has. And so it's kind of a nice um, if you like the idea of things being a little different from our world and some of that imagination and variety without the magic, or if you don't like the magical creatures or some of those, kingdom fantasy can be um a nice stepping stool, I guess, or a nice kind of a softer fantasy where it has some of those different elements that make fantasy more creative and unpredictable, but in a way that, I would say most Christians are very comfortable with, and yeah, it doesn't get quite as out there as some other fantasy. So like as I was, a noble purpose, the Cornerstone series that this is a part of is all kingdom fantasy. It's all non-magical. So I think non-magical fantasy is another way you could say it, but I think kingdom fantasy is just kind of
Has a nice
a
tone to
nicer
it.
sounding term for it.
So kind of like Princess Bride, only maybe not with magical Max in it.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Kind of along
Miracle
those
Max,
lines.
yeah.
Exactly.
That was
Yeah.
good.
Still
Miracle
still the
Max is
adventure
more
and the
like,
fun, but yes, not
That was
so much
good.
the
yeah.
magic piece.
Yeah, that was funny. All right. Any other questions or comments? Does anyone want to talk about?
Yeah, this is
Scrolling
really
through to
good.
see.
And I know I saw something in the chat about newsletters and sharing, and I
Oh,
agree.
that's
I
right.
saw something about that if
Oh,
they get too long, you're going to lose your readers.
Oh, yes,
I
that.
think a lot of authors do this who share about others, have a certain number of slots per
mm-hmm.
newsletter to kind of keep it a little more digestible for readers. And because
Hmm.
yes, if you have a little bit of content and then 10 book recommendations,
Yeah.
that's going to start to feel long unless they're all free or, something
Yeah.
extra exciting about them. So typically I do like 3 to 4 per newsletter. And I think that kind of keeps it a nice length where, it gives me plenty of slots to share with other authors and to do a number of swaps, but doesn't make my newsletter painfully long. And I've definitely, I think a lot of authors do that same kind of thing where it's like, they might have a certain either just 4 slots total per newsletter, or they might have I want 2 new releases, 2 sales, two
Mm-hmm.
Kickstarters. Some of them get really
Hmm.
specific about it, but yes, I think if you keep it to a reasonable amount. And so then you can kind of set that expectation with your readers that you're not going to overwhelm them with here are all these books that I promised to share about. That helps keep it a little more manageable. And I always put it at the end, so they certainly can skip it if they want. But a lot of times, if it is a brand new release that looks like it'd be right up their alley, or if it's a great sale or something like that, a lot of times it's actually something I think readers can find very valuable,
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
readers
as
get
long as it's
used to
not
what you're
overwhelming.
doing. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Readers
Oh,
get
sorry.
used to
No,
what
sorry.
you're
Go ahead.
doing too. If you
Mm-hmm.
usually do 3 to 4, that's what they're going to come to expect. So
Right.
it's not going to, and really, you're right that sometimes they may not read them all, but they'll still scroll. I mean, even
Hmm.
if they're not reading everything, and those at least those images are getting in their heads, and then they see it again,
Exactly.
and they see it again, and it's like I'm seeing this book everywhere. I'm going to buy it. So
Hmm.
you're giving that little bit, even if they don't necessarily read all the text that you might have to accompany it. And I think with book
Absolutely.
swaps too, or newsletter swaps, I mean, um, like I don't necessarily, if I'm doing a newsletter swap, I don't necessarily say, okay, you've got to do my book the same month I do your book. I was just like, if you need me to do your book, I'll do your book. And I would really appreciate it when I have a book out that you do my book, but it's not,
Right. Absolutely.
yeah, it's not like a necessarily tit for tat kind of thing right that
Hmm.
moment.
What's the name of that group you mentioned on Facebook that does indie newsletter
I think
swaps? Do you
it's
remember?
mm, Swoony fantasy authors, something like that. I can send it to you.
Okay.
But
I'll
yeah,
check.
it's I guess I think it's Swoony fantasy writer. It's something, it's got that the Swoony for romance, but something about fantasy too.
That's cute.
Good point. I should have had that ready because that's been a great resource for mostly clean, and people are good about kind of
Mhm.
sharing what level their books are so that people
Hmm.
can kind of choose, whether that be a good fit for their own readers or not. Um, but yes, I can get that exact
Yes.
name.
So a newsletter swap is when you share somebody's book and they share your book.
Right.
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. And as Johnny said, I mean, it's not always necessarily, we're going to share it the exact same month, but, sometimes it's like, hey, I'm looking for, or, I have a new release out. who's willing to share it. And then,
Mhm.
someone will say, sure, I'll share it in my next newsletter. I have something coming out in
Mhm.
August, would you
Yes.
share about mine then? And so I've
Yeah.
got a whole spreadsheet put together of
Yeah,
like
me too.
who I've got coming up for various
That
months,
leaves me out right there,
to keep track
Yeah,
of
spreadsheet.
everything.
just a note. You just have to have a
It
little,
can get to
little
be a
note.
lot, but
In May,
it
do
is,
this
it's a
book.
great way to support other authors
Yeah.
and to
Uh-huh.
just, share those readers.
Lori has a good newsletter that's not over the top, it's
That's
not too
good.
long. And man, I've got some of my friends, I'm like, I send out once a month. In fact, lately I'm like every 2 months just because of time.
Hmm.
But some of my friends, holy moly, I'm getting something once a week, even though it's short. I'm like, what again? When do you guys
Yeah.
have time to write,
Exactly. Yeah, that's too much for me
And
too.
do laundry and feed your
Yeah.
family and go to the grocery store.
And I know I've said this before, but one way to get my readers to keep going is I have a little contest every month, and it's the
Oh,
last thing right before I sign off. So they have to get all the way down there to see what I'm giving away for the month and to write to me and email me back and be entered in that
Somebody
contest.
asked on the chat asked about sharing book releases on. I don't do book releases on my newsletter. I do them on my Facebook page, author page. But
Hmm.
what I do on my newsletter, because I wanted to be different, was I have a section called What Am I Up To? And under that, I talk about what I've read since the last newsletter, what I am reading now, and what I'm listening to on Audible. And I'll
Ah,
give an opinion, sometimes a review. It just because like I said, I wanted to be different. And then I have a section there talking about if you really want to help an author out, don't follow a link. Go to Amazon, type it in and
mhm.
that gives a boost in the search engine, that type
Yes,
of thing. And I
yeah.
remind people of that every month. So I guess that's okay. I'm like,
I,
sometimes I'm worried, am I getting too long in
I
that? But
know.
trying to keep it short.
It's what may I yeah, you've just got to figure out your what you want to do and what you're comfortable with. And if your readers aren't unsubscribing, I guess you're doing okay.
Right now, I've only had one unsubscribe, and I think we got like 70 anyway, but
We
it
always get
grows a
that.
little bit every
So
time. So
it does.
maybe, I
It
mean,
makes me mad because I know these people signed up for the newsletter because they did it as part of a big thing.
yeah,
And then when they mark it as spam, it makes me mad because it's like,
yeah,
no, you were not spammed. I
right,
know you were not
right.
spammed.
Yeah.
But okay, you just sort of, all right, let's think. I'm really interested in your group things, because I mean it takes a lot of work for somebody to sort of be in control of that, make sure it all
Mhm.
happens. And I'm really glad that you do have new authors come in because it is such a great way for new authors to get published and to be part of something and to learn all that, the marketing and all the things that need to be done. But how do you make sure for a new author especially that that's going to be a quality book?
Mm,
I think that certainly is the risk,
Mhm.
is that, either, and I've seen people do it multiple ways. I think some authors are like, "Hey, I had this great idea. Come join if you want. Here are a few parameters," but otherwise are very hands off. And
Okay.
then I've also seen the other end of a lot of control, a lot of
Mhm.
so I think it kind of depends, if you're willing to take the risk that, as long as these books are clean, like some of them might be better than others, and that's just, the
That's just
readers
the
will
way
kind
it
of sort
is.
that out. That's certainly a risk you can take, or, you can insist on,
Mhm.
reading it yourself, before, being part of the editing process. So I've seen it done both ways. I think it kind of depends on how much time people have, how much they have invested in it. Because yes, that's something I was worried about too. But I think people did have just kind of self-selected as far as it's like, oh, certain books have kind of risen to the top as the highest quality, and
Right.
some aren't as popular, and that's kind of you know, I
That's going to happen.
I felt like I at least got to know all
Yeah.
the authors, so I could very much, as I was sharing about their books, I could at
Mhm.
least get excited about the authors and about,
Mhm.
the work they put into it, even if the book itself maybe wasn't as good as some of the other ones. So but yeah, it's a very fair question because it is kind of, if that's something that would really bother you, then yeah, it's, either you're going to have to not join those projects, or you need to be in one that's really putting in that extra level of effort to make sure that everybody's up to that quality level. Another thing that I've seen people do, sometimes people open it up to, post in a group of like, hey, I'm putting together
Mhm.
this. Does anybody want to join? But sometimes people will just select, if they know certain authors are really high quality, are great at marketing, whatever it might be, they'll reach out to those authors specifically. So, it certainly doesn't have to be an open-ended, anybody can
Mhm.
join kind of project. Especially if you're looking at, some of these projects are only like 8 books or that kind of thing. If you want to just hand pick the
Mhm.
authors that are going to be a part of it, that's another option. If there are people that you really trust to do a good job.
And then do you have a release schedule? Most of these groups have it like who's going to release when?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So like one of them I'm working on right now, there's a joint document that everybody is on, and
Mhm.
everybody, they had a list of dates available that are all kind of in a row on a certain day of the week. And then people could just sign up for which date works best for them. And it's far enough out in the future that, people can be hopefully somewhat flexible with
Mhm. Yeah.
what date, or they can just, be quick to hop on, I guess, and be the first one to sign up. But yes, and certainly both the projects I was on, I mean, things happen.
Of
People had to
course.
delay, or a couple
Of
people
course.
dropped out, that kind of thing. So again, it certainly I learned a lot as far as just
Yeah.
flexibility and like, okay, if it ends up being, 10 books instead of 12 books, is that really the end of the world? Like, I
Exactly.
guess not, or if one of them comes out later than we thought, like, oh well, it still came out, life
Yeah.
happens. So yes, the goal usually is to kind of be every Tuesday from,
Mhm.
September through, November or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
But yeah, there usually end up being a few variations, and as long as you
Great
communicate about
though.
it, like it all works out.
I'm glad to see the indie authors doing that because I mean, you think about it, of course, publishers have been doing this for a while. I mean, they can still be
Hmm.
standalone books, but they're putting them under a series heading and, and marketing them that way. And so it is definitely another avenue for authors and you get that support. I mean, everything you said, I just love that whole concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really do.
And I saw a question come up. I apologize. I didn't see the full question, but I think it was about recommending whether Christian authors of Romantasy go indie versus
Hmm.
traditional. I mean, certainly there are a few great traditional publishers who do this genre. Like Enclave is a great one that some of their books are definitely romantasy. I'd say especially if your book is explicitly Christian, it can be hard to, there just aren't a lot of publisher options. So certainly, if you're interested in traditional, there is absolutely nothing wrong with, pursuing those couple publishers and seeing what happens. But just know that, if there's a Christian component to your story, there aren't a lot of options out there traditionally. But there is a really thriving indie community too. So I think it really, depends on, I think for me, it was fantastic to start with a traditional publisher because I had no idea what I was doing when it came to the publishing side of things, the marketing side of things. And so I was able to learn a lot through that and gain a lot of confidence just to know that, someone thought my book was worth publishing. And so for me, it worked really well to start in that avenue. But then when last year I had joined these projects, I had a lot more confidence indie publishing, because I had had that experience with the traditional publisher and because I had that group of authors walking alongside me who they didn't want my book to fail, right? So if I had a question, a lot of them had already indie published, and so they had a lot of wisdom there, that they were more than happy to share. So for me that worked out nice to and I plan to continue to do some of each. I have more books planned in the series that I have with the smaller publisher, but I also plan to do more indie publishing. So it kind of depends on your comfort level there. I mean, there's a lot to learn to indie publish, but it also gives you so much flexibility as far as one thing I didn't mention, but like offering a small either short story or novella for free that's connected to your a bigger series or to connected to one of your other books. that you offer for free to like newsletter subscribers, or that, you can put that free book in a lot of like free promotions, that kind of thing with other authors. That can be huge too, but you don't have that kind of flexibility necessarily with a bigger publisher. You don't have the flexibility to, I want to put my book on sale when all these other fairy tale authors are putting their books on sale. You can't tell a publisher to do that. Whereas as an indie author, you have a lot more flexibility in some of those marketing tactics. So it kind of depends, um, where you want the support versus the flexibility, and kind of where things land. So I think, you can't go wrong either way. It's just, if you happen to get in with one of the small traditional, or with one of the small group of traditional publishers that do Christian romantasy, they do a fantastic job. But otherwise, indie is a really, really valid way to go. And there's a huge community there that you can get support from other authors as well.
Oh, you're muted, Johnny.
Thank you. Well, good, because I had to clear my throat. That was also so great. And yeah, thank you, Lori. This has just been wonderful information about a really fun topic too. So that was I learned a lot. So it was just
Good. Well, thank
wonderful.
you. This is really
Yeah.
fun.
Oh, we're so glad you were with us today. So next week we are kind of getting a head start on the 250th birthday of the United States. So let me read this what we're doing. We're doing our literary founders. And so we're going to talk about Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and someone else. We're not quite sure yet who that fourth person's going to be, and about the literature that they produced and how that shaped our beginning. So we're gonna, this is kind of an experiment, actually, I think for us. We'll just kind of see how it works, but just to get in the spirit of the 4th of July early. And like I said, next year is, the 250th birthday celebration. So that's big. It's very big. Stick around for the after party. We'll still have one. It's getting a little bit late, but do that. If you're watching the replay, we do invite you to join our Facebook group, check out our Facebook page, check out our Writers Chat YouTube channel. See all of our episodes, and we have a slew of them. So on all kinds of writing topics. Until next week, then everybody. We'll see you next week. Bye bye.